Hi, welcome to today's episode of Knitting with QueerJoe. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about fidelity in your knitting and what it takes for me to get a little bit distracted. But before we do that, why don't you go ahead and pick up your current project and feel free to knit along and knit with QueerJoe. So today's topic is really about how distracted I often am by potentially new projects. And I was talking with a friend, knitter friend, about what inspires them to be distracted from their current project to start a new one. And I think it's different for some of us. There's some of us who like to be monogamous, if you will, with their projects. I am not one of those people. I much prefer to have multiple projects going along, and just like the dog who's distracted by a squirrel, I'm easily distracted by a potentially new project coming along the way. And for me, all it takes is something of interest, especially if it's along the lines of what I'm trying to accomplish in my design or in my progress in learning to knit more or new or different things. So learning is a really important component when it comes to something that will distract me from my current project and put me onto something new. And so just the other day, I was walking through Facebook, and I saw a video of just some very quick tutorial on a new stitch design that I'd never seen before. It's called Little Hearts knitting stitch, and I really liked it a lot. So I decided to see whether I could incorporate that into a shawl pattern design. And I found that oftentimes when you take any stitch pattern design, that even well-known ones, things like old shale or even garter stitch, when you turn them on their side or turn them on a bias, oftentimes it creates a much different look and fabric and design element. And then if you incorporate color into that, oftentimes it even creates more. And so I found that oftentimes when I'm finding a new stitch that I find intriguing, I can try to use that in a way that I really like very much. So not only did I learn this stitch, but I actually created a tutorial for the Little Hearts knitting stitch so that folks can see how it's done. There's kind of a strange little crossover knitting component to the stitch that I found intriguing, and also thought that it would be a heck of a lot easier to show in video if I ever decide to publish a pattern than it would be to actually write it out. And so so I'll actually include the tutorial video at the end of this, but it will also be a separate standalone. So if you want to just go to the tutorial video at any time, there's a link down in the comment section to how to get there as well. So hopefully you'll enjoy that. But we were discussing something else with some knitters the other day, and I was talking about old shale, and somebody wanted to do the old shale pattern. And if any of you are familiar with doing old shale, it's basically a 16 stitch repeat. There's 4 rows of garter stitch or garter and stockinette stitch combinations. And then the 4th row is this combination of 6 decreases by knitting 2 together and 6 increases by yarning over and knitting 1 6 times. And so in essence, you're taking 6 stitches and increasing it to 12, and you're taking 12 stitches and decreasing it to 6 on these particular rows. And one of the things that somebody asked whether they could create one of those ever widening types of triangular shawls and use old shale in that. And I thought to myself, well, yes, you could do that, but it would be somewhat difficult, in my mind at least, to both have increases every other row type of thing if you wanted to grow it at that pace, grow the width of it at that pace, or whether you could, and how you would incorporate 6 decreases like altogether and 6 increases in terms of the stitch pattern of incorporating old shale. So if you could envision this, it would be like you've increased 2 stitches over the course of the last 3 rows, let's say, of your knitting, or 4 in total on each side of your triangle. And then you've got to incorporate a 16 stitch repeat into that. And so I was describing, I said, yes, you can do that. And there's ways that you can work that into a rhythmic way of trying to incorporate that stitch, but it would be complex to describe, very complex to write out as a design. You'd literally have to write out every combination of increased stitches and incorporating that into your old shell pattern stitch design. And so it's something I definitely wouldn't want to do. At which point, one of the people in the room was very challenged by this and had to go out and figure out how to incorporate old shell into an increasing width piece of fabric. And I thought that was really interesting because the challenge of doing something was inspiring him to drop a current project that he was working on and pick up something new. And so for me, it's learning. Whenever I learn something new, especially when it's regarding like a design thing that I've been trying to work out in my mind. And for him, it was clearly, That's Impossible was the perfect challenge for him to abandon a current project that he's been working on quite a bit and go to another one. It was funny, in that same room that day, it was a Zoom meetup for guys who knit. In the same room, there was somebody who was working on a very challenging design by Zandy Peters that incorporated a lot of stacked increases, similar to Foxpaws or Foxpaws design, if you're familiar with that, but it's different. And he's a staunch monogamist when it comes to his projects. So even though this was a challenging one, and he's inspired by challenging things as well, he stuck to that, and he wasn't at all like intrigued by a new stitch design like I was, or the impossible challenge of incorporating old shell into a ever-growing, ever-widening piece of fabric. And so I thought it was really interesting what inspired people to abandon a current project, at least for a short period of time, and pick up something else to do it. And I was wondering what it was that inspired folks like you to do that very same thing. And so feel free to write in comments any of the things that inspire you to be distracted to another project. I do have to say on my behalf that most of the projects that I start, I finish. Even if I drop them for a specific piece of time, I almost always go back to them and finish them up. There have been a few exceptions to that over the decades of time that I've been knitting. But for the most part, it really is something that I think I've said oftentimes that I think the most important skill or aptitude or characteristic of a knitter, to make somebody a successful knitter, I think one of the most important characteristics is perseverance. And I've said that often. I don't think it's patience, I think it's perseverance. And I certainly don't think it's skill or hand-eye coordination or any of those things that obviously you need some aspect of that. But I think it's perseverance. I think that stubborn, I will finish this thing, is an important characteristic. In fact, probably the most, for me at least, the most important characteristic to being a successful knitter. And so that seems to go against this kind of being distracted and picking up a new project, like squirrel type of distracting type of thing. But I have the ability to come back to a temporarily abandoned project oftentimes and pick that back up and finish it, because I think it's important. And I think it's important to have that kind of perseverance. Now, sometimes after a brief spell of not working on something, after having put it down for a brief period of time, I do find that if I pick it up again and I'm really not satisfied with it at all, that I probably wasn't satisfied when I was working on it before that either, but that wasn't the reason I dropped it. I dropped it because I was distracted by something else. But if I pick it back up and I'm similarly not interested in doing it again, then I do sometimes make the decision not to pursue it, But that would have been a decision I probably would have made whether or not I had abandoned it temporarily or not anyway. And so I think the perseverance aspect of it still comes into play, because even though I was working on one of my knitted cross-stitch scarves when I saw this Little Hearts knitting stitch tutorial and had to start working on something of it, and I'll show you both those projects in current knitting. I do have to say that I will always go back to that knitted cross-stitch scarf design that I was working on and finish that as well, because I think personally I enjoy working on that, and I'm all too happy to go back and finish working on that. So I highly encourage people to be diverse in their knitting, and or not, if they prefer to stick with something until it's done and just have complete laser focus on what they're currently working on. I don't have that same kind of discipline. I am much more distracted by shiny objects, and so if I see any of those shiny objects in my periphery, almost always I will drop whatever I'm working on and pick that up. And or if you're the type of person who finds a challenging new thing, you know, something that says that's impossible, as the perfect opportunity to pick up empty needles and a new ball of yarn and start working on something, I highly encourage that as well. And again, I'd like to hear anything that inspires you to temporarily abandon some of your current projects to pick up something new, and what you consider shiny and fun and exciting and something interesting enough to pursue instead of what you're currently working on. I guess that's it with regard to the theme for that. So leave those in comments. Now on to current knitting. So a couple of things I'm working on. Last you read in my blog, if you read the last entry in my blog, I was working on my knitted cross-stitch scarf. The knitted cross-stitch scarf is a pattern that I've done for years. I'm doing this in two different colorways. One was in the yarn that I pulled out of the Resolve cowl, the kind of indigo blue yarn that I pulled out of the Resolve cowl. And the other is a Cascade Heritage Paints sock yarn that I just love the colorway of. And so I decided to incorporate both those two, and it seems to be coming out really nicely. The other thing that I decided to do was, when I saw the Little Hearts pattern stitch design, I decided to cast on a lengthwise, and this will eventually be a rectangular shawl. It'll probably be about 5.5 feet long, and depending on how much yarn I have, it will probably be about 16 to 18 inches tall or wide. And but I think I'm just going to make it plain rectangular. I think just the lengthwise incorporation of the stitch is going to make it for a very nice loose and drapey gauged shawl with a little bit of a mesh. And I think it's going to come out really quite nice, but I'll let you know as we go along. God knows I might find something else that will distract me between now and the next blog entry. So until then, I hope this Knitting with QueerJoe episode finds you doing well and enjoying your projects. And again, please like my video, subscribe if you haven't subscribed to my channel. I've set up a specific playlist for all the Knitting with QueerJoes, and you can actually binge watch them if you want to by just playing that playlist. And I hope you're finding this interesting and equally as appealing as reading my blog. And if you have any comments, again, leave comments down below, or feel free to contact me via social media or on my blog at QueerJoe.com. Good to see you today, and hopefully you'll be enjoying your knitting projects for a long time to come. And until I see you next, continue knitting.